Hey guys, tonight we wander into a war you've probably forgotten, or maybe you never even knew it happened. The year is 1812. You're standing in the shadow of a young United States, barely 3 decades old, still figuring out how to tie its boots without tripping over. On the other side of the Atlantic, Britain, the world's most powerful empire, busy with Napoleon in Europe, yet still finding time to bully American sailors, seize ships, and remind this little republic who used to be boss. It's tense, it's messy, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you were actually there. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's fun to see how this little late-night history crew is spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drift into the uneasy silence of America in the early 1800s. The Revolutionary War feels like it just ended, but the scars haven't healed. Britain never really accepted the loss. Sure, they signed papers, but deep down, they treated the US as a rebellious child who might come crawling back. You can feel it in the way their ships stop American vessels, dragging sailors off decks and pressing them into service for the Royal Navy. Imagine being a dock worker in Baltimore, waving your brother goodbye as he boards a merchant ship, only to hear weeks later he's been kidnapped mid-ocean to fight Napoleon's wars. Mainstream historians usually frame this moment as America trying to assert its sovereignty, but for ordinary people it was simpler. Anger, humiliation, and fear. You look around the port cities, Boston, New York, New Orleans, and you hear tavern chatter full of fury. But it's not all unity. Farmers in the countryside mutter, "Why risk everything for a fight with Britain again?" Here's the odd detail most people don't realize. America wasn't remotely ready for another war. The army? Tiny. The navy? Laughably small compared to Britain's. The government was still broke half the time, relying on customs duties just to pay the bills. It's like picking a bar fight with the biggest, meanest guy in town while you're still tying your shoes. And yet, the war hawks in Congress, men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, pounded their fists for honor, expansion, and respect. Scholars still argue whether the war was really about defending sailors or about a hunger for land. Canada to the north, Florida to the south. You stroll into a smoky congressional hall in your mind's eye, listening to the heated debates. Some whisper about liberating Canada as if it's low-hanging fruit, while others insist this war is about national pride. You can feel the room split down the middle. One half sees opportunity, the other sees doom. As you sit in that tension, the storm clouds gather overhead, literally and figuratively. Britain, stretched thin by European wars, keeps poking the American bear without realizing how restless it's become. And in the taverns, on the docks, even in sleepy farmhouses, whispers turn to louder voices. Maybe it's time to stand up, even if the knees of this young nation still wobble. You lean back, hearing the faint creak of wooden floorboards, smelling salt from the harbor. The war hasn't started yet, but it's already breathing down your neck. And you know, once it begins, nothing will be the same for this fragile republic. You're in the year 1812 now, and the rumble of discontent is no longer just tavern talk. It's pounding like war drums. You drift through the crowded streets of Washington, D.C., which, by the way, isn't the marble paradise you picture today. Back then, it's more like a muddy village with scattered buildings and far too many mosquitoes. Yet in one of those buildings, Congress, the nation is deciding whether to hurl itself into another war. You lean against the wooden rail, as fiery men, called warhawks, shout themselves hoarse. Henry Clay, young and charismatic, insists that American honor is on the line. He practically spits the words as he claims Britain treats America like a colony. Across the aisle, cautious voices warn, "We're not ready, we'll be crushed." You can almost hear their hearts pounding as they weigh the risk, fight or fold. And then it happens, the first formal declaration of war in American history, signed by President James Madison on June 18, 1812. You let the ink sink into the parchment in your imagination, the loops of his pen trembling under candlelight. It's official. The United States just declared war on the British Empire. Again. You know that feeling when someone pokes the bear and then suddenly realizes they've also tripped over a hornet's nest. That's Madison right now. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The vote for war was shockingly divided. In fact, every single Federalist voted against it. It wasn't the United Front of 1776. New England, with its merchants tied to British trade, wanted no part of this madness. So even as you drift into the war's early days, you can feel it. America isn't fighting as one nation, but as a fractured collection of states. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. The U.S. Army, so ill-prepared for conflict, actually had more generals on its roster than enlisted men at one point. Picture a whole bunch of officers strutting around with shiny titles, but barely anyone to command. You smirk at the absurdity, like a theater troupe with too many directors and no actors. You watch farmers reluctantly handed muskets, their fingers clumsy on the triggers. These are men more used to plowing fields than firing volleys, and scholars still argue whether Madison truly believed the U.S. could win, or if he simply hoped Britain was too distracted by Napoleon to respond with full force. Either way, the stage is set. You shift your gaze northward now, to the Canadian frontier, where many Americans think victory will be quick and easy. It'll be a simple march, they boast in taverns. Canada will greet us as liberators. You raise an eyebrow, because, spoiler alert, they absolutely won't. But for now, the optimism is thick enough to choke on. The summer air in 1812 feels heavy. You can hear hoofbeats of messengers riding out with word of war. You imagine yourself in a small village, listening as the news spreads. Gasps, cheers, curses. Some young men puff up their chests, ready to enlist. Others shake their heads, muttering that this is folly. And all the while, in the back of your mind, you sense Britain stirring. Not amused, not distracted forever, just waiting. The declaration has been made. The die has been cast. You exhale slowly, realizing you're about to step into a war most people today barely remember. But for those living it, the fear was very, very real. You drift north now, where the border between the United States and Canada stretches like an open invitation. The air is thick with overconfidence. American leaders tell themselves, this will be easy. Canada, after all, is sparsely populated and defended mostly by militia. How hard could it be? You shake your head, because you already know this is going to end badly. You step into Detroit in the summer of 1812. The fort looms on the edge of the frontier, its wooden palisades creaking in the breeze. General William Hull, an older man with little taste for battle, has been ordered to invade Canada. You watch him shuffle maps on his desk, muttering under his breath about shortages of supplies and poorly trained troops. His soldiers, mostly farmers and shopkeepers, aren't exactly eager to cross into enemy territory. Still, the plan is made. The invasion begins. Here's your historical fact. America actually invaded Canada, not once, but 3 separate times during the War of 1812. And each time, it went about as well as a chicken trying to swim. The first attempt, led by Hull, fizzles almost immediately. His men cross into Canada, but hesitate, facing not just British soldiers, but indigenous warriors allied with them. The Americans retreat, morale sinking like a stone in the Detroit River. And here's your odd detail. Hull was so terrified of indigenous fighters, especially those led by the famed Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, that he surrendered Detroit without a serious fight. Imagine handing over an entire fort, cannons and all, because you convinced yourself the enemy was too fearsome. His own soldiers were furious, and you can almost hear them cursing his name as they trudge into captivity. You wander the camps that night, hearing whispers. "We were supposed to be the liberators," one young man mutters, staring into the fire. Another slams his fist against a log, spitting out, "They didn't welcome us, they fought us." It's dawning on them that Canada isn't going to roll over. Scholars still argue whether Hull's surrender was cowardice or cold pragmatism. Did he save lives by giving up early, or doom America's reputation by folding so quickly? You lean back and picture the stunned silence in Washington when news arrives. The first big move of the war is an embarrassing failure. But you don't stay in Detroit forever. You drift east, following the rivers and lakes that snake between America and Canada. In the distance, you see redcoats moving with precision, indigenous warriors painted for war, and small groups of Americans stumbling in the mud, unsure of their purpose. The night feels heavy, the air filled with damp wood smoke. You realize this isn't the glorious march people imagined. It's chaos, confusion, and humiliation. And the war has only just begun. You hover along the misty waters of Lake Erie, where the horizon seems endless, and the war suddenly shifts from muddy fields to vast, unpredictable waves. The early campaigns on land may have been humiliating, but on the lakes, there's still a chance for redemption. You spot shipyards springing up almost overnight. American carpenters hammer together planks with a frenzy, racing against time. In Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, a young naval officer named Oliver Hazard Perry is orchestrating the construction of a fleet. He's not a famous hero yet, just a determined man with piercing eyes and a stubborn streak. You watch him bark orders as sawdust fills the air. His goal? To wrest control of Lake Erie from the British. Here's your historical fact. Naval supremacy on the Great Lakes was absolutely crucial. Whoever controlled those waters could move troops and supplies freely, tipping the balance of the entire northern frontier. Without ships, armies were stranded. But here's the quirky detail. Perry's fleet wasn't exactly built with the finest resources. Timber was rushed, nails were scavenged, and in some cases, cannons were hauled from distant forts. One ship even mounted mismatched guns, like a Frankenstein war vessel patched together with whatever they could find. You chuckle, imagining Perry pacing the deck, muttering, "She'll float," hopefully. As the fleet takes shape, you drift to September 10th, 1813. The Battle of Lake Erie begins. The morning mist burns away, and you see British sails on the horizon. Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, engages first. The thunder of cannons shakes the air. Splinters fly like deadly confetti, ripping through decks and bodies alike. You move closer and see Perry himself, bloodied but unbroken, refusing to give in as his ship is torn apart. At the last possible moment, he grabs his battle flag, the one that reads, "Don't give up the ship," and rows through a hail of fire to transfer his command to the Niagara. You feel the oars creak, hear the splash of water, sense the defiance in every stroke. From the Niagara, Perry unleashes devastating broadsides. British ships stagger under the assault. One by one, they lower their colors. And then it's over. Perry scribbles a quick message to General Harrison. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." You can almost see the ink drying on the page. Scholars still argue whether Perry's victory was pure genius or partly dumb luck. After all, the British fleet was stretched thin, and some of their ships were undermanned. But whatever the reason, the result is undeniable. America now controls Lake Erie. That night, you drift through the quiet aftermath. The lake, once churning with violence, lies still under the stars. Wounded men groan softly, and the smell of gunpowder lingers in the damp air. You can almost feel Perry's exhaustion as he stares at the dark water, knowing this unlikely triumph has changed the course of the war. From the embarrassment at Detroit to this moment of glory, the war is already a roller coaster of humiliation and redemption. And you sense it's far from over. You follow the rippling echoes of Perry's triumph as they roll across the frontier, boosting American morale. But victory on water doesn't erase the chaos on land. You drift southward, where the Ohio Valley stretches wide, its forests thick and shadows heavy. Here, another figure dominates the war. Not a general in red or blue, but a Shawnee leader whose very name sends a chill down American spines, Tecumseh. You see him standing tall in council, his presence commanding, his words sharp as flint. For years before this war, Tecumseh tried to unite Native nations into a confederacy strong enough to resist the tide of American settlers flooding westward. Now, with Britain as his ally, he's more dangerous than ever. His warriors, skilled in ambush and wilderness combat, are ghosts in the trees. Here's your historical fact. Tecumseh's Confederacy represented one of the last great organized efforts by indigenous nations to halt American expansion. And during the War of 1812, his influence turned frontier skirmishes into nightmares for U.S. troops. Odd detail, American soldiers were so unnerved by the thought of Tecumseh nearby that rumors spread of him being in two places at once. Some swore he could cover miles in a single day. Rallying warriors across vast forests, fear magnified his legend until he became less a man and more a phantom of war. You drift to October 1813, the Battle of the Thames in Ontario. The British, retreating after Perry's Lake Erie victory, try to regroup, Tecumseh fighting at their side. The battlefield is a mess of mud, smoke, and shattered lines. You see Tecumseh rallying his warriors one final time, his voice fierce, his spirit unbroken. But then, chaos. Shots ring out. He falls. Scholars still argue over who actually killed him. Some claim an American officer named Richard Johnson fired the fatal shot, while others say the truth was buried in the confusion. What's certain is this: with Tecumseh's death, his Confederacy collapses. The vision of a united indigenous resistance dies with him. That night, you wander through the silence of the battlefield. The forest presses in, damp with autumn rain. Campfires burn low as men whisper about the fallen leader. Even among his enemies, there's a strange respect. One American soldier writes that Tecumseh fought like a true warrior, never begging, never breaking. You feel the shift in the war. Without Tecumseh, the frontier tilts. Native resistance, once so fierce, begins to fragment. America, bruised but stubborn, presses forward. And yet, as you leave the forest behind, you know this loss isn't just strategic, it's tragic. A world Tecumseh dreamed of, where native nations stood shoulder to shoulder, has vanished into the night. The war rages on, but a powerful voice has gone silent. You drift from the silence of Tecumseh's forest to a different kind of battlefield. One that doesn't smell of powder, but of politics, fear, and firelight. The war has dragged on, and now the British decide to make a point, not with cannons on the frontier, but right in the heart of America's capital. It's August 1814. You feel the sticky summer air of Washington, D.C., a city still half-finished, its wide avenues dusty, its monuments more hopeful sketches than solid stone. You wander into the grand domeless Capitol, a building that still smells faintly of plaster. Politicians argue here, puffing with self-importance. Yet they don't know that soon, the debate won't matter, because British boots are marching closer. The Battle of Bladensburg comes first, just outside the capital. American militia scatter like dry leaves in the wind, leaving barely a fight. One officer mutters that it's the greatest disgrace ever seen. And then you hear the tramp of boots, the bark of orders, the crackle of torches. The British march straight into Washington. Here's your historical fact. On August 24th, 1814, British troops set fire to Washington, D.C. They burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and yes, even the White House, which then was called the Executive Mansion. Odd detail? The First Lady, Dolly Madison, became a folk heroine that day. As the British closed in, she refused to leave until she secured a full-length portrait of George Washington. She cut it from its frame, rolled it up, and fled with it strapped to a wagon. Imagine it, smoke rising behind her as she clutched the image of America's first president like a lifeline. You stand in the city that night as flames consume everything. The White House windows glow like furnace doors, the roof collapsing with a groan. Sparks rise into the humid sky, raining down on cobblestones. Citizens flee, staring back with hollow faces as their capital dissolves in smoke. Scholars still argue whether this was vengeance for the Americans torching York, modern-day Toronto, earlier in the war, or whether it was just meant as a show of power. Either way, the effect is chilling. You can almost hear the crackle of timbers, the shouts of soldiers, and the eerie quiet that follows when a city's heart is reduced to ash. Then rain. A storm sweeps in, sudden and violent, pounding the embers. Some say it saved the city from total ruin. You feel the cool drops on your skin, the sky itself weeping for a young nation humiliated. But humiliation has a strange effect. Instead of collapsing, America hardens. In taverns and cabins, farmers and merchants talk of revenge, of pushing back harder. You sense it, the anger smoldering beneath the soot. For now, though, the capital lies blackened, its streets empty. You drift away from Washington with smoke still clinging to your clothes. A reminder that this war is no longer about distant borders. The British have walked into America's front yard, lit a match, and dared the nation to endure. You leave the ashes of Washington behind and drift eastward, carried on the smell of salt air. The year is still 1814, and the Chesapeake Bay ripples beneath British sails. Their navy prowls like wolves, blockading ports, strangling trade, and sending patrols into small rivers and villages. America gasps for breath, but out here on the water, you feel a different rhythm. The British decide Baltimore will be next. Unlike Washington, though, Baltimore is ready. You stand at the edge of Fort McHenry, a star-shaped bastion bristling with cannon, perched on the Patapsco River. Soldiers bustle. Powder kegs roll into bunkers, and nervous citizens crowd the shoreline, watching sails appear on the horizon like ghosts. You hear whispers of a lawyer named Francis Scott Key. He's not supposed to be in the thick of things, yet he finds himself aboard a British ship, trying to negotiate a prisoner's release. When the British commanders laugh and say he can't leave because he now knows too much, you realize he's about to witness history from an unusual seat. September 13th, 1814. The bombardment begins. For 25 hours, cannons roar and rockets scream through the night. You wince at the sound of Congreve rockets, a British invention that whistles before it crashes, scattering sparks across the dark. Mortars boom, shells arc overhead, and Baltimore shakes with each blast. Here's your historical fact. The defenders at Fort McHenry fired back steadily, refusing to yield. Despite the storm of over 1,500 shells and rockets, the fort never fell. Odd detail? The British had brought their own little barge with musicians to play jaunty tunes during the bombardment. Nothing says psychological warfare like a brass band scoring your city's destruction. You hover near Francis Scott Key as he leans against the rail. straining to see through the smoke. He writes scraps of verse by lantern light, his words fumbling into rhythm, the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. He doesn't know it yet, but you can tell. This man is sketching the bones of a song that will outlive the war itself. Dawn breaks after a hellish night. The bombardment ceases. Silence, except for the groan of the wounded and the hiss of smoke on water. You look toward the fort, and there it is, a massive flag still waving defiantly over the ramparts. Scholars still argue whether the British truly could have pressed harder to take the fort, or if they simply decided Baltimore wasn't worth the losses. Either way, their fleet slips away, defeated. The flag keeps flying. Francis Scott Key keeps scribbling. And in the years to come, his poem, set to a borrowed tune, will become the Star-Spangled Banner. As you drift from Baltimore, the echoes of cannon fire fade, but a new sound rises, the swell of voices singing. Not yet an anthem, not yet a national identity carved in stone, but something beginning to take root. You smile at the thought, because even in the middle of this messy, forgotten war, a symbol is born. You slip from the Chesapeake coast into the thick forests and chilly winds of the northern frontier. The war has many faces, and this one looks frostbitten and grim. By 1814, as Baltimore's defenses stand proud, battles rage far to the north, where the U.S. and Britain clash over control of Canada. Here, the lines are blurred. Settlers, traders, native nations, and soldiers all tangled together in a landscape of lakes and rivers. The British, determined to squeeze America from every angle, set their eyes on the north. Their plan? Sweep down from Canada into New York, using Lake Champlain as a watery highway. If they succeed, they'll split New England from the rest of the young nation. You feel a chill in your bones, not just from the September air, but from the weight of what's at stake. Plattsburgh becomes the stage. A sleepy lakeside town suddenly swells with militia, regular troops, and nervous families peeking from shuttered windows. On the water, a flotilla is hastily assembled, commanded by a brash, young American named Thomas MacDonough. He's clever, maybe even reckless. You watch him and his men practice swinging their ships on anchors like dancers rehearsing a final step. It looks strange at first, like boats pirouetting in slow circles, but you realize he's preparing a trick. The British arrive with a larger fleet and seasoned troops. Their drums pound, their sails snap, and their bayonets glitter in the autumn sun. On September 11th, 1814, the Battle of Plattsburgh explodes. Cannons thunder across the water. MacDonough fires a cannon so close to his own face that he's knocked flat by the recoil. But he scrambles up, dazed but alive, and keeps commanding. His ships perform that strange maneuver you saw earlier, swinging around to bring fresh guns to bear. The British ships can't match the choreography. Slowly, the tide turns. Here's your historical fact. The American fleet, smaller, outgunned, and seemingly cornered, pulled off one of the most decisive naval victories of the war, forcing the British to retreat. Odd detail. During the chaos, a British cannonball hit a coop and sent a rooster flying across the deck of MacDonough's flagship. Instead of panicking, the rooster crowed loudly, like some feathered herald of victory. The men cheered, taking it as a sign they wouldn't lose. On land, American soldiers and militia held firm, harassing British troops and blocking their advance. Scholars still argue whether the British truly intended a full conquest or merely wanted bargaining power at the peace talks. Either way, the result is the same. Their grand invasion sputters out at Plattsburgh. The air smells of gunpowder and wood smoke as you drift through the aftermath. Broken masts lean over the water, cannonballs sit half buried in the mud, and wounded men moan in the fields. But in the American camp, you feel a pulse of pride. Against all odds, a northern frontier town had stopped an empire. The victory ripples outward. negotiators across the ocean in Ghent suddenly find America holding stronger cards at the table. Back home, weary citizens dare to hope that maybe, just maybe, the end of this strange, grueling war is near. Yet, as you look north, the forests remain silent and watchful. The land still holds secrets of treaties broken, native nations betrayed, and borders redrawn in smoke. You realize that while the cannons fall quiet here, the echoes of this frontier war will linger long after the ink dries on any peace. You shift now to the vast, unpredictable expanse of the Atlantic, where the war rages on a different stage, the sea. The year is 1812, and the United States Navy, tiny but spirited, dares to challenge the Royal Navy on the high seas. You feel the spray of salt water on your face, hear the creak of timbers, and smell the sharp tang of gunpowder as frigates prepare for battle. You drift toward the USS Constitution, famously nicknamed Old Ironsides. The ship sits proud in Boston Harbor, its hull thick, its cannons gleaming. Sailors scurry about, loading powder and shot with precision. The British, confident that a handful of ships can crush the American Navy, underestimate these men. You can see the Americans' determination in every glinting eye, every stance, every tightened fist. Here's your historical fact. Old Ironsides earned her nickname when British cannonballs seemed to bounce harmlessly off her sturdy oak hull during the Battle of the Atlantic. That oak, you realize, is more than wood. It's a symbol of resilience. Odd detail? Sailors sometimes had a curious superstition. Before battle, they would nail shoes into the deck or stick them under the cannon for good luck. Some swore that the shoes brought protection. Others did it simply because it distracted them from fear. You watch a young sailor wiggle his toes in a wooden shoe, whispering to it like a tiny guardian. The battle begins. Cannon fire erupts across the waves. Smoke curls into the sky, obscuring sails, while splinters rain down on decks. American crews reload faster, fire more accurately, and maneuver with agility. You feel the tension knot your stomach as the ships collide in a deadly ballet. Scholars still argue whether the success of early naval battles was due to superior American gunnery, better morale, or just dumb luck on the part of the British. Either way, the victories build confidence, proving that even a fledgling navy can stand against the mightiest empire. You drift closer to see a small boat detach from the Constitution, carrying dispatches that will later spread the news of the victory. Sailors cheer, shouting over the roar of battle, while others tend to the wounded, their faces streaked with soot and salt water. And then, for a brief moment, the ocean calms. Smoke drifts lazily, sunlight glinting off rippling waves, and you can almost hear the sigh of relief from exhausted sailors. These moments, between cannon blasts and chaos, feel fleeting but precious. On the horizon, other American frigates take their positions, emboldened by the Constitution's triumph. The message is clear. America's Navy, though small, will not simply bow to the British. Pride swells across the ports back home. Merchants, politicians, and farmers all feel it. A spark of hope in a war otherwise marked by hardship. As you drift above the churning Atlantic, you realize the war isn't just fought on land. It's a contest of wills, strategy, and courage across forests, rivers, and seas. And the Americans are slowly learning that sometimes determination and ingenuity outweigh sheer numbers. You move inland now, to a quieter but no less crucial theater, the western frontier along the Mississippi and the southern Gulf Coast. Here, the war feels different. Less like formal battles, and more like a constant, tense struggle against supply shortages, disease, and guerrilla tactics. You drift over New Orleans, a city brimming with cultural diversity. French Creoles, enslaved Africans, free black citizens, and a motley crew of American soldiers, all coexisting under a canopy of Spanish-style buildings and humid air. The British, having suffered setbacks in the north, set their sights south. Control of the Mississippi means control of trade, movement, and influence. You see troops landing, the soldiers grim and disciplined, marching through sugarcane fields and cypress swamps. The locals watch cautiously, knowing that whichever army wins here will determine the fate of their homes and livelihoods. Here's your historical fact. The Battle of New Orleans would occur after the peace treaty had technically been signed in Ghent. That news traveled slowly across the Atlantic, so the fighting continued. Odd detail? The American defenders under General Andrew Jackson included pirates, real ones, who volunteered to defend the city. Jean Lafitte and his men, experts in coastal navigation and cannon handling, provided knowledge and firepower that many historians still describe as pivotal. You watch these men, rum in hand, smirking at redcoats while preparing deadly artillery. The battle begins on January 8, 1815. Cannons roar across the marshlands. Musket fire cracks, and the British attempt repeated frontal assaults against a fortified American line. You feel the tension coil like a spring, knowing that each volley could change the outcome. The Americans, including Lafitte's pirates, hold firm behind earthen works and cotton bales, which surprisingly absorbed the impact of cannonballs. Scholars still argue whether the overwhelming American victory here was due to superior defensive positioning, the composition of troops, or just the British misjudging the terrain. You drift along the line of redcoats, struggling through knee-deep mud and frozen marsh water, while American sharpshooters pick them off with lethal precision. As the sun rises, the battlefield quiets. Hundreds of British soldiers lie wounded or retreating, the rest staggering back toward their ships. Jackson's forces, surprisingly intact, cheer quietly but with exhausted relief. You see Lafitte lean on a cannon, wiping sweat and soot from his face, smirking with that familiar mix of bravado and grim satisfaction. The victory at New Orleans sends shockwaves back home. Despite the technical end of the war, Americans feel a surge of pride, a sense that their nation has survived not just a foreign threat, but also the test of its own chaotic organization. You float above the city as the river sparkles in the morning sun, seeing people emerge from homes, tentatively celebrating. In this southern theater, the war shows you a different kind of heroism. Ordinary people, irregular forces, and pirates working alongside soldiers. And as the smoke lifts, you sense the irony. The final major battle of a forgotten war is remembered more vividly than some of its larger campaigns. You drift into the quiet aftermath, where the war's echo lingers across the Atlantic, forests, and rivers. Negotiators from Britain and America sit across polished tables in candlelit rooms, quills scratching on parchment as they hammer out peace. You float above the chambers, sensing the tension, the subtle glances, and the careful weighing of pride versus practicality. You overhear American delegates insisting on recognition of pre-war borders and fair treatment of native nations. Though, as history will show, the latter point is largely ignored. The British, weary from Napoleon's wars and their own stretched resources, want to end the conflict swiftly. You feel the sense of relief in the room. Months of blood, fire, and uncertainty will finally conclude. Here's your historical fact. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, effectively ended the War of 1812 and restored pre-war boundaries. Neither side gained significant territory, but the treaty symbolized a return to peace. Odd detail? Delegates on both sides exchanged small gifts, tea, pastries, even pipes, trying to maintain civility. You can almost see one British negotiator offering a tiny porcelain cup, only for an American delegate to quip, "I hope this doesn't start a war of etiquette." It's a brief moment of levity amid the weighty negotiations. Scholars still argue whether the treaty addressed the real causes of the war, from maritime rights to impressment of sailors, or if it merely papered over tensions to buy time. You float past the chambers, sensing that the war's grievances, though temporarily paused, will fester quietly. Meanwhile, news of peace travels slowly. American troops in the north and south, still engaged in skirmishes, have no idea the treaty exists. You drift over battlefields already frozen by winter, soldiers trudging through mud, snow, and debris. They fight with courage, oblivious to the fact that diplomacy has already resolved the conflict. In New Orleans, Jackson and his men celebrate victory, unaware that the war is technically over. You observe Lafitte laughing with soldiers, tossing a coin in the air, while nearby, civilians begin the painstaking work of rebuilding homes, clearing marshes, and tending the wounded. The Treaty of Ghent signals the beginning of a new era for America. You sense a tentative national pride forming, born from surviving humiliation, foreign invasions, and the resilience of ordinary men and women. It's a fragile but potent feeling, one that will grow into the identity of a nation still young, still learning how to stand on its own. And as you drift away from Ghent, you realize this forgotten war may be overlooked in textbooks, but its lessons, heroism, misjudgment, and endurance, are stitched into the fabric of a nation. You watch smoke rise from campfires, ripples on lakes, and sails retreating across oceans, feeling the war's echoes settle quietly into memory. You glide back across the continent, lingering over the landscapes transformed by nearly 3 years of war. From the northern forests to the southern swamps, the echoes of musket fire, cannon blasts, and drum beats still resonate faintly, like distant thunder long after a storm has passed. The United States has survived, battered and bruised, but somehow intact. You drift over towns and cities, seeing reconstruction in progress. In Washington, the charred remains of government buildings are slowly replaced with brick and stone. Workers hammer, saw, and mix mortar under a cautious sun. In Baltimore, celebrations continue, yet the memories of the bombardment linger, tucked into every scarred street and soot-stained brick. You notice children playing near ruins, their laughter defiant against the ghosts of smoke and fire. Here's your historical fact. While the Treaty of Ghent restored pre-war borders, it didn't resolve all the tensions that sparked the conflict. Maritime rights, trade disputes, and Native American displacement would continue shaping the young nation's policies. Odd detail? Across the frontier, soldiers returning home would occasionally keep souvenirs. Shards of cannonballs, splintered musket stocks, even captured enemy hats, as reminders of battles they barely survived. You can almost see one man polishing a dented drum, whispering a quiet curse at the British, while his family looks on in bemused fascination. Scholars still argue whether the War of 1812 should be remembered as a second war of independence, or merely a regional skirmish blown up by patriotic retelling. You float over each battlefield, each fort, each battered ship, and feel the truth in both arguments. It was both humiliation and triumph, failure and survival. In New Orleans, Jackson and Lafitte's pirates mingle with locals, recounting improbable feats of courage. Stories of Tecumseh's valor and Perry's Lake Erie victory pass from one listener to another, growing in legend like whispers carried by the wind. You drift among these stories, realizing that memory and myth will shape this war more than any single cannon blast. The sun sets over the Mississippi, casting a golden glow across fields and rivers. You linger on a quiet riverbank, listening to the gentle ripple of water, the distant call of birds, and the soft murmur of survivors rebuilding their lives. The nation has endured, not because of flawless strategy, but because ordinary people refuse to break. You feel a final, comforting weight in the air. A sense that the lessons of this forgotten war, the cost of arrogance, the value of resilience, and the strange alchemy of human courage will echo for generations. And as night falls, You let the darkness carry you slowly, softly, across the continent, through a nation still finding its identity, still dreaming of the future. The night drapes itself gently over the land, and you drift into the quiet spaces between memory and history. Smoke from past battles fades into the air like soft whispers. Rivers glint under a moon that casts pale silver across forests, plains, and the fragile, still-standing towns of a nation tested and tempered by fire. The world feels calm now, as though holding its breath after the roar of war. You wander past the remnants of forts, the echoes of cannonballs, and the quiet homes where families repair what was broken. Even the forests seem to exhale, trees creaking softly as a cool breeze drifts through branches. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls, its song both mournful and hopeful. You notice the small, tender details: a discarded musket leaning against a barn, a shutter swinging gently in the night wind, the reflection of starlight on a calm lake, the chaos, the fear, and the fleeting victories of men long gone settle into soft patterns. You imagine the soldiers, sailors, and civilians laying down their heads, feeling the weight of exhaustion and the gentle comfort of survival. The rivers, the lakes, and the quiet towns become a lullaby, each ripple and rustle a note in a melody of endurance. You let your mind float with these sounds, letting the slow rhythm of the night ease tension. The war, forgotten by many, becomes a story whispered across time, one of human courage, folly, and resilience. And as you drift, soft and steady, you feel a subtle warmth of hope for a nation still young, still learning, still breathing under the vast, starry sky. End of script. Sweet dreams.